This is the Transatlantic Alliance. It's a series of economic, political, and military ties that unite Europe and North America. For the past 75 years, it's been labeled the world's strongest alliance and has played a major role in global affairs. It's part of a broader network that the US set up after World War II to ensure peace, prevent communism, and expand its influence. But at the end of the Cold War, the alliance lost its purpose, and the allies which shared common histories, interests, and values have drifted apart. More recently, it's come under direct attack by the United States, the very country that set it up.
First, America first.
But now, with Chinese assertiveness and Russian resurgence, it's once again finding purpose. To understand the transatlantic relationship, we have to understand that America's foreign policy, for most of its history, has moved between two extremes: isolationism and interventionism. Isolationism comes from the belief that national interests were best served by staying out of foreign conflicts. Interventionism, on the other hand, considers that active involvement in international affairs could have some benefits to national interests by helping establish global security. In the early phases of World War II, isolationism prevailed, but the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor led to the United States joining the war. After the defeat of the Axis powers, the US became involved in shaping global affairs, and the US's involvement in Europe was deemed in American interest. At the outset of the Cold War, the US President Harry Truman initiated his doctrine of containment to prevent communism from spreading, based on the principle of collective security.
He declares political war on Soviet Russia. From now on, it means that anti-communist America will make its influence felt in European affairs.
As a result, the US and the Soviet Union established spheres of influence on the territories that they had liberated, splitting Europe in two.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The American involvement and alliance with Western Europe became permanent. It first took the shape of economic aid. The Marshall Plan provided Europe with billions of dollars to buy American goods and rebuild its war-torn economy.
In Washington, where the U.S. Congress finally voted about $5.5 billion for aid to Europe.
This would help the US by kickstarting the economies of potential trade partners, but was also seen as key to prevent large communist parties in France and Italy from coming into power. To counter the Soviet Union, the US also backed early efforts at European integration and provided a security guarantee to its allies. It was the first country to recognize the European Coal and Steel Community, a precursor to the European Union, and it established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which stationed troops in Europe and promised mutual defense in the case of aggression. At the same time, the US reshaped the world order. It led to the creation of international organizations such as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. These institutions created rules which underpinned international trade and were designed to secure peace. At the same time, the rules they pushed for enshrined American dominance over much of the world. While Western Europe retained its independence during the Cold War, it was closely aligned with the US. Security interests, economic ties, and shared values formed the foundation of the relationship. In return for American commitment and protection, its allies accepted its dominant international role. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and the US emerged as the world's only superpower, things started to change. The post-Soviet states integrated into the West, joining the EU and NATO despite Russian opposition and US promises to stay out of Russia's former sphere of influence. But as Europe was no longer the theater of US-Soviet competition, American interest waned. The US started to increasingly act unilaterally, placing less value on the international system it helped build. The US refused to ratify several international treaties. While it entered Afghanistan with the support of its allies after 9/11, it also invaded Iraq, without UN Security Council approval and despite European opposition. In the Obama years, Europeans worried about declining US commitment to Europe, as the US shifted its focus to Asia and the Pacific.
America may have started as a series of ports and cities along the Atlantic Ocean, but for generations we have also been a nation of the Pacific.
American withdrawal, low defense spending, which has fallen since the end of the Cold War, and Russian resurgence have led to doubts about European security. And then, in 2016, Donald Trump was elected as US president. While previous presidents had shifted away from multilateralism, Trump's foreign policy broke from it entirely. His America First slogan echoes of the isolationism of the 1920s. He argued that allies took advantage of the US, pointing to the American trade deficit with the European Union and the low defense spending of European countries.
But 23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying.
And to the frustration of the EU, he was pro-Brexit. Trump attacked traditional allies, labeled NATO as obsolete, and called the European Union a foe on trade. It opened up a rift between the US and EU and led to calls for autonomy. Yet the relationship is once again finding relevance, even if there are significant differences that have changed the dynamic. The US is now looking to overcome the differences that have emerged over the past 30 years to focus on its main priority.
China, 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 China.
China. That is what the current US President, Joe Biden, wants. Even as he questions if democracies can compete, he's intent on rallying American allies. However, the EU is still scared by the Trump years, and as recently as 2020, has sought to find a balance between the US and China. And it is worried that American attempts to rally democracies against China would damage its economic ties. Chinese assertiveness and human rights abuses are making it increasingly difficult for Europeans to justify closer ties with China. After Western countries imposed sanctions over forced labor in Xinjiang, counter-sanctions halted the ratification of the EU-China Investment Agreement. The EU has also joined the US and UK in condemning Chinese cyber attacks. These steps reduce the likelihood of EU-China cooperation in the future. And while the EU has labeled China as a
negotiating partner, for example, when it comes to climate change,
it has also called it
a systemic rival.
Tellingly, the EU's chief of diplomacy, Josep Borrell, stated that the European Union will always be closer to Washington than to Beijing. At the same time, Joe Biden is looking to reset the rest of the relationship, to restore credibility and rebuild the economic and military ties that were the foundation of the alliance.
We will repair our alliances and engage with the world once again.
Calling the transatlantic relation a cornerstone of all that he hopes to accomplish, Biden moved to resolve long-standing issues with Europe. The US rejoined the Paris Agreement, agreed with Germany on Nord Stream 2, and helped implement a global tax minimum. Yet several issues continue to undermine the relationship. The trade war and tariffs started by Trump remain, and there is a disagreement on how to regulate and tax big tech. These differences are deepened by diverging approaches to climate change. Although both sides now share long-term ambitions, the EU's climate policies are creating tensions with the US. Its planned carbon border tax would make the US goods less competitive in the European market, depending on how emissions intensive they are. On the diplomatic and military level, there's the question of Afghanistan.
It's time for American troops to come home.
Biden saw the US's continued involvement as a distraction from other priorities. But the decision, which was made unilaterally, is leading European leaders to question the US's security commitments. On NATO, Biden has urged allies to do their fair share, while expressing US commitment to European security. At his first summit, he reasserted NATO's collective security function against Russia, but also shifted some of the focus to China. Yet the continued threat from Russia, which the US now views as a secondary rival, implies that European countries will have to step up to ensure their own security. The EU is looking to develop the ability to carry out security tasks independently. In the long term, it would mean developing capabilities to fend off Russia, and it means playing a bigger role in regional security, like with Opération Barkhane in the Sahel, where France alongside EU allies are involved to fight off Islamist groups. Brexit has complicated the ability of European countries to come together, as the UK seeks to develop a position independent from the European Union. Having lost a member with a powerful military, it makes it more difficult for the EU to set up independent military capabilities in the future. Nonetheless, an old idea to have the EU develop strategic autonomy in terms of military capabilities is gaining traction. But not all agree, with German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer having championed America as a security provider and dismissed European autonomy as an illusion. The US also fears that the strengthening of European capabilities would lead to a weakening of the alliance, particularly NATO's role. Regardless, the days of the unconditional Atlantic alliance in which Europe was the center of American interest are gone. With US foreign policy shifting towards Asia and diverging priorities, Europe and the EU are increasingly expected to carry their own weight and chart their course more independently. However, on issues such as security, autonomy remains a distant prospect. The dynamic of the relationship has changed due to the different interests and priorities, but there are still key issues on which interests align, and common values continue to connect the two blocs. This was Into Europe. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to